Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of the most chilling stories I've ever received. This one comes from someone who wrote about a family road trip in the late 1980s that took a horrifying turn. Their email detailed an encounter with what they believed to be the infamous Mothman of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, creature known for its eerie presence and the tragedies that seemed to follow it. Let me take you back to that night, as if I were the one behind the wheel, living every terrifying moment. I'd been driving for hours, the endless road rolling beneath the wheels of our old family station wagon. It was late fall, the kind of evening when the air grows crisp and sharp, with fog creeping over the hills like a shroud. My younger sister Maggie was dozing in the back seat, her headphones crooked, a faint hum of music spilling out into the stillness. Mom had fallen asleep too, her head resting against the passenger window, but I was wide awake, the soft rhythm of the tires on asphalt keeping me alert. We were on a family road trip, heading to visit relatives in Ohio, but the route took us through West Virginia specifically, a quiet stretch of highway near Point Pleasant. I remember glancing at the clock, 10:37 p.m. The night was so dark it felt like the stars had hidden away, leaving the world beneath an oppressive, moonless void. The radio had long since gone to static, leaving only the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car as company. I'd rolled the window down slightly to let in the cool air, the faint smell of wet leaves and pine cutting through the stuffy interior. The road ahead was deserted, flanked by thick woods on either side. The trees, bare and skeletal in the autumn chill, reached toward the sky like desperate hands. My headlights illuminated the winding path, but everything beyond was swallowed in darkness. And then, out of nowhere, it happened. A flash of movement. Something darted across the road just ahead of me, too fast for me to see clearly. My foot slammed on the brake instinctively, and the tires screeched in protest. The car lurched forward, and Maggie yelped awake in the back seat, her headphones falling off. "What the hell?" I muttered, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. "What happened?" Maggie asked, her voice thick with sleep. I don't know," I stammered. "I think something ran across the road." I scanned the edge of the highway, my heart thudding in my chest. There was nothing, no deer, no raccoon, nothing. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and the thick fog rolling in around their roots. Mom stirred in her seat, blinking groggily. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Probably just an animal," but as I eased the car forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fog grew thicker as we drove on, curling around the car like tendrils, making it harder to see. My grip on the wheel tightened as I focused on the faint stretch of road illuminated by the headlights. Maggie had fallen back asleep, and Mom was quiet, her breathing steady. But I felt on edge, like I was being watched. And then I saw them. Two red lights, glowing faintly in the distance. At first, I thought it might be the taillights of another car, but they were too high off the ground, far too high. They hovered just beyond the reach of my headlights, blinking slowly, as if they were alive. I slowed the car, my stomach knotting with unease. "Do you see that?" I whispered, glancing at Mom. "See what?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Those lights," I said, nodding toward the woods. She squinted, leaning forward, but before she could answer, the lights disappeared, gone, as if they had never been there at all. "I think you need some rest," she said, her tone gentle but dismissive. I didn't respond. My eyes stayed glued to the road, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the woods were silent, eerily so. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed absent, replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. The road curved sharply ahead, and as I rounded the bend, my stomach dropped. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the glow of the headlights, was something. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of it. It was easily 7 feet and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its body too thin, and its skin was dark and leathery, almost like it was stretched too tightly over its frame. And then there were the wings. They were massive, spanning out behind it like the tattered remnants of a giant bat. The edges looked jagged, almost torn, and they shimmered faintly in the light, as if they were wet. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They were the same glowing red orbs I'd seen before, burning with an intensity that made my chest tighten. They locked onto me, unblinking, as if they could see straight into my soul. For a moment, I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. And then it moved. The thing spread its wings with a deafening whoosh, the force of it shaking the car. It let out a low, guttural screech sound that didn't belong in this world and launched itself into the air, disappearing into the fog above. "Go!" Mom screamed, her voice breaking through my paralysis. I slammed on the gas, the tires spinning for a moment before the car lurched forward. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "What the hell was that?" Maggie cried, clutching the back of my seat. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know." But as we sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching us. And this time, it wasn't going to let us go so easily. The road seemed to stretch on forever, every shadow in the fog morphing into the outline of something lurking, watching. My foot was heavy on the gas pedal, the station wagon groaning as we hurtled through the mist-shrouded highway. The thing the Mothman, as I later learned it was called, wasn't just some bizarre trick of the light or a hallucination. It was real, and I could still feel the oppressive weight of its presence, like an invisible force pressing down on me. Maggie was in tears now, clinging to the back of my seat, her voice a frantic whisper. "What was it? What did we see?" "I don't know," I snapped, harsher than I intended. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, but I didn't dare loosen my hold. The road twisted sharply, and the tires skidded slightly as we took the turn too fast. Mom, usually the composed one in any crisis, was pale, her knuckles white as she clutched the dashboard. Her lips moved silently praying, I realized. I couldn't blame her. The fog was relentless, thick and suffocating, and the headlights barely cut through it. The tension in the car was suffocating. Something in my gut told me that if I did, I wouldn't like what I saw. And then we heard it. A loud, rhythmic thudding. At first, I thought it was the engine protesting my reckless driving, but no. This sound was coming from above, us directly above. "Oh my God," Mom whispered, her voice trembling. "It's following us." The thudding grew louder, heavier, like something massive was beating the air above us with powerful wings. The station wagon jolted slightly, and Maggie let out a scream. "Stop it," she cried. "Make it stop." I had no idea what to do. I couldn't outrun it, not in this old car. But stopping wasn't an option either. The thing had made it clear that it wasn't letting us leave without a fight. "Hold on," I said through gritted teeth, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to them or to myself. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. The sound of the wings grew deafening, and then, with a sickening crunch, the roof of the car buckled inward slightly. "Get off!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The car swerved violently as I tried to shake the thing loose, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt. The roof groaned under the weight of whatever was up there, and I could hear its claws scraping against the metal, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The pressure on the roof lifted, and the sound of the wings faded into the distance. But the relief was short-lived. "Look!" Maggie screamed, pointing out the window. My eyes darted to the side, and there it was flying parallel to us. The red eyes burned like twin coals, and its wings moved with an eerie grace, silent now except for the occasional whoosh as it dipped closer to the car. It wasn't trying to escape. It was toying with us. Just as I was beginning to think the nightmare would never end, the road opened up ahead, and I saw it. The silver bridge, spanning the wide, dark river. The bridge was old, its steel trusses rusted and creaking, but in that moment, it felt like salvation. "Hold on," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as the station wagon sped onto the bridge. The thing, whatever it was, didn't hesitate. It followed us, its massive wings beating the air, its red eyes locked on the car. The bridge creaked ominously under the weight of the car, and I could feel the vibration through the steering wheel. My mind raced, torn between two impossible choices. If I stopped, we'd be at its mercy. But if I kept going, there was no guarantee the bridge could hold. And then it happened. A loud, metallic groan echoed through the night, followed by a sharp crack. The bridge shuddered violently, and I barely managed to keep the car on the road as chunks of rusted steel began to fall away. "Drive," Mom screamed. "I'm trying." The creature swooped low, its shadow engulfing the car. I felt its claws scrape against the roof again, and this time they tore through the metal, leaving jagged gashes that exposed the interior. Maggie was screaming, Mom was praying, and I was holding on for dear life. The end of the bridge was in sight now, but the road ahead was crumbling, pieces of the asphalt falling away into the dark, swirling river below. The thing let out another screech, this one so loud and piercing it felt like my skull was splitting. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to lose control. But then, somehow, we made it. The car lurched off the bridge just as another section collapsed behind us, the deafening sound of metal and concrete crashing into the water ringing in my ears. The creature didn't follow. It hovered for a moment, its red eyes glaring at us from the other side of the chasm, before disappearing into the fog. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, hours later. By then, the sun was rising, and the nightmare of the night before seemed almost unreal. But the scratches on the roof of the car told a different story. We never spoke of what happened that night, not to anyone. The story of the Silver Bridge collapse, which occurred later that week, sent chills down my spine. People said the Mothman had been seen near the bridge in the days leading up to the tragedy, as if it had been a harbinger of what was to come. I don't know if that's true, but one thing is certain. Whatever we encountered that night wasn't human. Even now, all these years later, I can still see those glowing red eyes in my dreams. And I know, deep down, that it's still out there, somewhere, waiting. Hey everyone, welcome back. I've got something eerie to share with you tonight, a story from an email sent by one of our listeners who asked to remain anonymous. What they described was chilling, and as I read it, I couldn't help but feel like I was living the events myself. They called it the Mothman. If you've heard of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, you probably know the legend. Some say it's a warning, a harbinger of disaster. Others believe it's something far darker. But let me take you to that foggy night on a desolate road where it all began. The email started with something familiar, an impromptu road trip. The listener described how, years ago, they had packed up a beat-up sedan and decided to visit the quiet, rural corners of West Virginia, looking for a little adventure and solitude. I imagined myself in their shoes as I read. The road was dark that night, the kind of darkness where your headlights barely penetrate the void. I was driving alone, with nothing but the faint hum of the radio to keep me company. Around me, fields stretched into the unknown, punctuated by patches of dense woods. The air smelled of wet earth, and every now and then, a light mist rolled across the road, swirling eerily in the beams of my car. The trip was supposed to be peaceful, a way to disconnect from the chaos of daily life. But peace wasn't what I found. It started subtly. My car's radio, already faint, crackled with static. At first, I thought it was just poor reception, but then the static grew louder, harsher, until it drowned out everything else. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I reached to turn the dial, trying to fix it. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights, there was a figure, tall, unnaturally so, with broad shoulders and an unsettling stillness. My foot hovered over the brake, and for a moment, I thought I was seeing things. Maybe it was a tree or a shadowy mind playing tricks in the darkness. But then it moved, with a fluidity that didn't seem human. The figure stepped forward, and my headlights caught it fully. Its body was dark, almost blending into the night. But its eyes, those eyes, were like glowing embers, piercing through the gloom and locking onto me. Panic surged through me. I pressed the gas pedal, my car lurching forward as I sped past the figure. My heart raced, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. I didn't dare look back. The road seemed endless, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. I kept my eyes on the asphalt ahead, my mind replaying what I had just seen. What was it? A prank? My imagination? The car jolted as I hit a pothole, snapping me out of my thoughts. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping, like something massive beating against the air. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, closer. My chest tightened as I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was. The figure was following me, flying just above the ground with massive, bat-like wings that seemed too large for its body. Its eyes glowed brighter now, fixed on me like a predator locking onto prey. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The thumping of its wings filled my ears, drowning out the sound of my engine as I pushed the car to its limits. Suddenly, the radio blared to life, emitting a high-pitched whine that made me wince. I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, the car's headlights flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice shaking. The lights came back on, but the figure was gone. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement on the side of the road, keeping pace with my car. The thing was running now, its long limbs moving in an unnatural, almost insect-like gait. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, the speedometer climbing as the car roared down the narrow road. I didn't care about the sharp turns or the possibility of hitting something. I just needed to get away. The figure suddenly veered off into the trees, disappearing from view. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But then, the car shook violently, and a loud thud echoed from the roof. It was on top of the car. I swerved wildly, trying to shake it off, but the weight remained. The sound of its claws scraping against the metal sent chills down my spine, each screech louder than the last. "Get off!" I shouted, though I knew it couldn't hear me or wouldn't listen if it could. The car veered dangerously close to the edge of the road, and I forced the wheel back, desperate to stay on the pavement. The weight on the roof shifted, and I heard the crunch of metal as its claws dug in deeper. Out of sheer desperation, I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, and I felt the weight lift as the thing was thrown forward. But it didn't hit the ground. Instead, it hovered in the air, its massive wings beating slowly as it turned to face me. I could see it clearly now, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Its body was thin and elongated, covered in a texture that looked almost like feathers but darker, more menacing. Its eyes burned red, filled with an intelligence that sent a chill through my soul. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall. Then it let out a sound, a deep, guttural screech that reverberated through my chest. It wasn't just a noise, it was a warning. I threw the car into gear and sped off, not daring to look back again. By the time I reached the outskirts of Point Pleasant, my nerves were frayed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made my heart race. The creature hadn't followed me, at least. I didn't think it had. The town was eerily quiet, its streets deserted despite the late hour. I parked my car near a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the fog. For a moment, I debated whether to go inside. I needed to calm down, to feel safe. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin. The mist was thicker here, swirling lazily under the dim streetlights. My footsteps echoed as I approached the diner's door, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The interior was dated but clean, with red vinyl booths and a long counter lined with stools. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to me, as she filled a coffee pot. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the empty space. The waitress turned slowly, her expression unreadable. She was an older woman with tired eyes and a forced smile that didn't quite reach them. "Late night?" she asked, her voice flat. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Coffee?" I nodded again, sliding into a booth near the window. As she poured the coffee, I glanced outside. The fog had thickened. "You're not from around here," she said, setting the cup in front of me. "No," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. "Just passing through." She stared at me for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Strange things happen around here at night. You'd do well to keep moving." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer, just turned and walked back behind the counter. I sipped the coffee, its bitterness doing little to steady my nerves. The silence of the diner was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. And then I felt it, that same sense of being watched. I turned my head slowly, scanning the fogged-up window. At first, I saw nothing but my own distorted reflection, but then a pair of glowing red eyes appeared, staring at me through the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The creature was there, just outside the diner, its massive wings partially folded against its back. Its eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the glass, through me. "Don't look at it," the waitress said sharply, her voice breaking the spell. "Whatever you do, don't look at it." I tore my gaze away, my heart pounding. "What is it?" I whispered. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she came over and sat across from me, her hands trembling as she placed them on the table. "Some call it the Mothman," she said finally. "Others say it's something older, something worse. It shows up before bad things happen, warns you maybe, or causes them. No one really knows." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Why is it following me?" She shook her head. "I don't know." I stared at her, unable to process what I was hearing. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Get out of town before it's too late." I left the diner in a daze, the waitress's words echoing in my mind. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see my car. As I reached for the door handle, I felt a sudden gust of wind, cold and sharp, that sent the fog swirling around me. And then I heard it, that deep, rhythmic thumping, the sound of its wings. I looked up, and there it was, perched on a street lamp above me. Its wings were spread wide, silhouetted against the dim light. The sight of it was both majestic and horrifying, a nightmare made flesh. It tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The creature didn't respond, but its wings began to move, beating the air in slow, deliberate strokes. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble with the force of it. Suddenly, the street lamp flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my car keys, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door and scrambled inside. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking spot, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. As I sped through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, still following me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Point Pleasant, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. But even now, I can't escape the memory of those burning red eyes, the sound of its wings, the oppressive sense of dread that still lingers. The Mothman isn't just a story, it's real. And if you ever find yourself on a lonely road in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, you'd better hope it doesn't find you. Hey everyone, it's great to be with you again. I've got a chilling tale for you tonight, Tone, that will make you think twice about the quiet, lonely corners of the world. This one comes from an email I received recently. The sender didn't leave a name, but after reading their story, I understood why. It all started a few months ago, when I found myself at the edge of a small rural town in America. I was on a road trip, exploring places that most people would consider off the beaten path, just me and the open road. You'd think the quiet would bring peace, but there's something unsettling about the silence that blankets a place like that. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're completely alone. The town I stopped in, I'll call it Weaver's Hollow, was as desolate as any place could get. It had a handful of old, weathered houses, most of which were abandoned. The streets were cracked and overgrown with weeds, the few lampposts flickering on and off as if they couldn't decide whether they should stay on or give up. I was passing through, looking for a place to stretch my legs and grab a bite. When I walked into the only diner in town, a bell above the door jingled, but the place was nearly empty. There was one old man sitting in the corner booth, his back hunched over a cup of coffee, staring out the window. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, didn't seem to notice me at first. When she finally looked up, her face went pale. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded and ordered something simply sandwich and some water, but as I sat there waiting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the eerie quiet of the town. It was like a weight was pressing down on the air, suffocating the very essence of life. The waitress brought my food over with shaky hands, her eyes darting around nervously, like she was expecting something or someone to burst in through the door at any moment. "Don't stay here too long," she said, lowering her voice. "People in this town don't like strangers." I tried to brush it off as some small-town paranoia. I finished my meal, thanked her, and paid my bill. But as I walked out into the street, I noticed something strange. The old man from the booth was standing by the window, watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that felt like he was seeing right through me. As I got into my car, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. My heart raced, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. I decided to leave the town immediately, but that night, when I laid my head down to sleep in a cheap motel a few miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and breathe with a life of their own. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like a sign that something was waiting to make its move. It was then that I checked my phone and found the email from the anonymous sender. The subject read, "You're not the first to feel it." The email contained nothing but a few lines of text. "You were in Weaver's Hollow, weren't you? I've been there too. You felt it, didn't you? The way the town pulls you in, the way it makes you think you're safe, but you're not. The people there, they know what happens after dark, and I don't think you'll leave like you came. You'll see what I mean soon." I stared at those words, my hands shaking. Whoever wrote this knew exactly what I had just experienced, and I knew, deep down, that something had followed me from Weaver's Hollow. But what? What was it that I had felt? That cold, suffocating presence? I had to go back to find out, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for what awaited me. It took me a couple of days before I could even think about returning to Weaver's Hollow. But after that email, that nagging sensation in my gut, I knew I couldn't just forget about it. There was something wrong with that place, something that lingered in the air, in the eyes of the people. I had to find out what it was. The next morning, I packed my things, checked out of the motel, and headed back towards the town. The sun was setting by the time I arrived, casting long, ominous shadows across the road. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway in eerie unison, their branches creaking like the sound of bones grinding together. It felt like I was driving into a different world zone where time didn't move the same way it did elsewhere. As I passed the same cracked street signs, the same dilapidated houses, the town felt even more desolate than I remembered. I parked my car by the diner, hoping to find someone who could tell me what was really going on. But when I entered, the place was empty except for the waitress. She was standing behind the counter, her eyes wide and panicked. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you shouldn't have come back." I tried to keep my voice calm, but the unease I felt was creeping up on me again. "What's going on here? Why does this place feel so wrong?" She glanced nervously at the door before speaking in a hushed tone. "The town, it changes people. You won't understand until it's too late." She paused and took a shaky breath. "You need to leave. They're coming for you." "Who's coming for me?" I asked, my heart racing. The old man from the corner booth appeared at the door then, his eyes locking onto mine. Without saying a word, he walked over to the counter and took a seat. His presence was almost suffocating, and I couldn't help but feel like he was silently warning me to turn around and leave while I still could. I could see the fear in the waitress's eyes as she turned to him, but she said nothing. She was scared, but not of him. No, she was scared of something far worse, of something that neither of us could outrun. Just then, the bell above the door jingled again, though no one entered. The sound was distorted, as if something was messing with it. The temperature in the room dropped, and the air grew thick, almost unbearable. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, and that's when I saw it. A shadow flickered across the back of the diner, too quick to be human, too dark to be anything natural. It moved, fluid and impossible, like it was shifting in and out of reality. I froze, my eyes glued to the corner where it had disappeared. For a moment, there was nothing. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing, raspy, uneven, as though someone or something was standing right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The waitress's face had gone as white as a sheet, and her lips trembled. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook, pushing it towards me. If you're going to survive this, you need to understand. This is what they all have in common. The ones who never make it out, they all experienced it. I took the notebook with trembling hands. Inside, the pages were filled with hastily written notes, scribbled over and over again in frantic handwriting. It was hard to make sense of it at first, but the more I read, the clearer it became. The people who lived in Weaver's Hollow weren't like normal people. They were part of something dark. Something that tied them to the town in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. It was clear that whoever had written these notes had been driven mad by whatever haunted this place. There were mentions of a ritual, an old curse, and something that was waking up with each passing night. The townspeople weren't just inhabitants of Weaver's Hollow, they were the guardians of a secret, something buried deep within the land. And the shadow I had seen? That was just the beginning. Suddenly, the old man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You've seen it, haven't you? You felt it crawling inside of you." I felt a chill run through me, but I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, the words stuck in my chest. The waitress grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have to go. Now, it's not safe. The town doesn't let go of its visitors. Once it has you, it keeps you." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and that's when I heard the sound of feet shuffling slowly across the floor. It wasn't just one pair of feet, it was many. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and twist, elongating like they had minds of their own. And then they stepped out. The first figure was tall, thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, sunken into a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. It reached towards me with long, claw-like fingers. I stumbled backward, knocking over the chair behind me, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, and that's when I realized there were more of them. All of them emerging from the darkness. The waitress's voice was barely a whisper, but I heard her clearly. "Run. Don't stop. Whatever you do." I didn't need to hear anything more. I turned and bolted out of the diner, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I ran into the street, the sound of shuffling feet followed me, getting closer with every step. I knew they were coming for me now, and this time, there was nowhere to hide. I didn't dare look back. My feet pounded against the cracked pavement, the air growing heavier with each breath I took. The sound of shuffling footsteps, slow, deliberate, was still right behind me, as if the shadows themselves had come alive and were hunting me down. I reached my car in a blur, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. The shadows in the street seemed to stretch and writhe, closing in on me, cutting off any escape. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment I thought I might pass out from sheer panic. But then, as if some unseen force shoved me forward, I managed to unlock the door and dive into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, just as one of the figures stepped out from the darkness, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. I shoved the key into the ignition and twisted it. The engine sputtered, stalled, then roared to life. I hit the gas, tearing out of there with my hands clenched tight on the wheel, not caring about the speed limits, not caring about anything but getting away from whatever was behind me. The road stretched out in front of me, the headlights illuminating the endless expanse of trees and empty fields. But I knew I couldn't outrun them. They weren't bound by the same rules as I was. Whatever these things were, they weren't just in the town, they were in the land itself. I looked in the rear-view mirror. The figures were standing in the middle of the road now, watching me, unmoving. There was something unnerving about the stillness of their presence. They didn't need to chase me. They knew I'd come back. They knew I couldn't leave until they were done with me. A cold, icy chill washed over me as the realization hit. They weren't just hunting me, they were waiting for me to understand, waiting for me to see the truth. I had to go back. There was no escaping them, not unless I knew what they wanted. The drive out of Weaver's Hollow felt like a dream, but not a peaceful one. It was like I was moving through thick fog, each second stretching out endlessly. The trees, the fields, everything looked the same as when I first arrived, but somehow it was different. It felt like I was moving through a distorted version of reality, a parallel world where time and space didn't quite function right. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually, the town faded from view, swallowed up by the night. I pulled over to the side of the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. My hands were still shaking as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. I needed to think, needed to figure out what was happening. That email, the one from the anonymous sender, kept playing over and over in my mind. They'd said it themselves. You'll see what I mean soon. The curse, the ritual, whatever it was, it had started to pull me in, and I wasn't sure how to break free. I grabbed the notebook from the diner, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was getting more frantic as the entries progressed. It spoke of the Hollow, a place that existed outside of time and space, a place where the land itself was alive, feeding off the souls of the living. People who came to the town never left. They were consumed, their essence drawn into the ground, becoming part of the curse that bound the town together. But the most disturbing part? It said that the town was awake now, stirring, as if it had been waiting for me. And the more I read, the more I began to realize it was a warning. They wanted me to understand, to witness the town's hunger. I started the car again, my mind racing. The only way to survive was to find the truth, though uncover whatever secret the town was hiding. I had to go back, but this time I wasn't going to be unprepared. I turned the car around, my heart pounding in my chest, as the road seemed to stretch before me like a tunnel that had no end. There was no turning back now. As I got closer to Weaver's Hollow, the air grew heavier, thick with tension. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was waiting for me. When I reached the outskirts of town, the streets were eerily quiet. The buildings were all but abandoned, their windows shattered or boarded up. But there, in the distance, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. A light. It flickered weakly from one of the houses at the end of the street. It was a soft, pale glow, like a lantern's light. But there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't natural. I parked the car a few yards away and approached cautiously. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could hear the faintest hum, like the sound of whispers carried by the wind. The door to the house was cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of light spilling out into the street. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and mildew. But there was something else, something metallic like blood. The flickering light came from a small oil lamp sitting on a table in the middle of the room. It cast long, grotesque shadows on the walls, stretching and twisting like they had a life of their own. And that's when I saw it. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words scraped in deep, jagged lines, as though someone had used a knife to carve them into the surface. You can never leave. I stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out across my body. The air felt thick with an oppressive weight, like I was breathing in something alive, something hungry. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft rustling, like footsteps approaching. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. And then I felt it. A hand, cold as ice, brushed against my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as that cold, unseen hand lingered for a moment longer on my shoulder. I could feel its icy touch, its presence pressing against me like a weight too heavy to bear. My skin crawled, every inch of my body screaming at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't move. The fear was too powerful, paralyzing. And then, slowly, I turned. There was nothing there, just empty space. But I knew that something was standing just beyond my reach, watching me, waiting. The whispers from outside the room seemed to get louder, like they were coming from every direction at once. They were faint at first, like a distant murmur, but now they were close, suffocating. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to find the source of the sound, desperate to find some way out of this nightmare. The oil lamp flickered again, casting a grotesque shadow on the walls. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my vision, a dark shape, impossibly tall, too large to be human. But when I blinked, it was gone. And that's when I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, heart racing, but there was still no one there. The air felt suffocating now, thick with the scent of something foul like decay, but deeper, older. My pulse hammered in my ears as I backed away from the table, my hands trembling. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door, I noticed something strange, a piece of paper stuck to the back of it, torn and yellowed with age. The edges were frayed, and it had been hastily pinned there, as though someone wanted it to be found. With trembling hands, I pulled it down and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but legible. "The town will have you. It always does. It takes a piece of you, and it never gives it back. You will be one of them soon. No one ever leaves. No one who sees the hollow survives. It's watching you. It's waiting for you to join." I stared at those words, the blood draining from my face. They were written by someone who had already become a part of this nightmare, someone who had felt the pull of Weaver's Hollow and couldn't escape. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was reading. The truth was becoming clearer now. The town, this cursed place, didn't just trap its visitors physically. It consumed them, pulling them into its dark, twisted grip until they became one with it. Just like the figures I had seen, the ones that stalked the town. They were the lost souls, the ones who had been taken. The whispers grew louder now, almost deafening. I slammed the paper back onto the wall and turned, frantically scanning the room for an exit, for any way out. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and contract, like they were alive, closing in, tightening around me. I could feel them now, crawling over my skin, seeping into my very soul. I turned towards the door again, and this time, I ran. I didn't care if I was making noise or attracting attention. I just needed to get out of that house, out of this town, before it was too late. But as soon as I reached the door, it slammed shut in front of me, a force so strong that it rattled the frame. I yelped, stumbling back, my hands pressed against the door, desperately trying to open it. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate shuffling from behind me. It was the same sound I had heard before, the sound of something following me, hunting me. I turned around, but there was nothing, just the suffocating darkness that seemed to press in from every side. Then, a figure stepped into the dim light. It was the old man, the one from the diner. His face was even more gaunt now, his eyes sunken into the dark hollows of his skull. He was standing at the entrance to the room, blocking the only way out. His lips curled into a thin, twisted smile. "You're here now," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "And you'll stay here like all the others. You think you can escape, but you can't. The hollow doesn't let go." I backed away, fear rising in my chest like a tidal wave. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows growing longer, more distorted. And that's when I realized the entire house, the entire townlet was part of the curse. It was alive, feeding on the souls of those who wandered too close. The old man's smile widened as he stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Welcome home," he whispered. And then, suddenly, I wasn't in the house anymore. The world around me shifted. the ground beneath my feet seeming to vanish. I was floating, suspended in some kind of endless void. The sound of the whispers was deafening now, swirling around me like a storm, a cacophony of voices, all of them calling my name. "You're one of us now." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I was drowning in the voices, the shadows, the overwhelming sensation that I no longer existed as myself. And then there was a new voice, a voice that cut through the others like a knife, clear and sharp. It was the same voice I had heard in the diner. The waitress. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice trembling. "You're part of the Hollow now. You can never leave." Suddenly, I snapped back into the dimly lit room. The figure of the old man was gone, but the oppressive feeling remained. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I tried to focus, tried to get a grip on reality. But I knew deep down I was no longer just a visitor. I was one of them now. The town had claimed me, and there was no escaping its grasp. And the worst part? I wasn't alone. They were all around me now, those who had been lost to Weaver's Hollow before me. Their hollow eyes stared at me, their voices rising in a chorus of whispers. They were waiting for me to join them. The room around me was suffocating, the walls pressing in closer, tighter with every breath. I could feel the weight of their eyes on Metham, the lost souls of Weaver's Hollow. They were everywhere, watching, waiting for me to finally understand. But I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to be a part of this place, this curse that clung to everything in the town like a thick, decaying fog. I had to fight. I had to get out, no matter what it took. I stumbled toward the door, my heart racing, every inch of my body screaming for escape. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices overlapping each other, all of them urging me to stay, to accept. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood what this was, what had happened to all the others who had come before me. The door wouldn't open. It was like the walls themselves had grown flesh, holding the frame shut with invisible hands. Panic swelled within me, and I yanked on the handle with all my strength. Nothing. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of footsteps, again the unmistakable sound of those who had already been claimed by the Hollow. It was them. They were coming. They were going to pull me into the darkness, and I wouldn't be able to resist. But there was one thing I hadn't seen yet. One thing I didn't understand. Why? I turned around, my eyes scanning the room frantically. The figures were emerging again, but this time, they weren't as far away. They were standing at the edges of the room, some of them close enough that I could see their features or what was left of them. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken into their skulls. Their skin hung loose, like it was barely clinging to the bones beneath, and they were all smiling. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, hidden beneath a layer of dust and decay, was an old, rotting book. The edges of the pages were yellowed, brittle from years of neglect. But there was something about it, something that felt like it might hold the answer I was desperately searching for. I stumbled toward it, my legs weak beneath me, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I picked it up, I could feel the weight of it in my hands, like it was alive, pulsing with the same sinister energy that had infected the town. The cover was made of a material that resembled human skin, strange, unsettling. It was old, cracked, and stretched thin across the spine. I opened it, feeling the dust rise in the air, coating my lungs with each breath. The pages were filled with more of that frantic, scrawled handwriting. Some of the words were faded, but others stood out clear as day. The Hollow claims all who wander too close. It is the land, and the land is the curse. The people who live here are not human. They are vessels. Vessels to contain the Ancient One, the one who has been here long before, the one who is bound by the blood of this land, the one who is waking. As I read, the room seemed to warp around me. The shadows in the corners grew darker, stretching and reaching for me like tendrils, creeping across the floor. The air was thick, heavy, as if something was trying to reach inside of me, pull me into the same void that had consumed everyone else. I flipped the pages faster now, my hands shaking. The writing grew more desperate the further I went, until it became nothing more than random scribbles, like the writer had lost all sense of time, all sense of self. But there was one final entry that stood out, and it was the last thing I read before everything around me went black. Once you see the hollow, once it finds you, there is no escape. The land will take you, and you will never leave. You are a part of it now, and it will never let you go. Suddenly, the whispers reached a crescendo. It was as if the voices were coming from inside my mind, pressing against my skull, vibrating with the force of 1,000 souls. I dropped the book, my mind spinning as the room around me seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls warped, twisted into impossible shapes, and I could hear the sound of the land, the hum of something ancient, something hungry. And then, as if the town itself had decided to claim me, the ground beneath me cracked open. I fell, plunging into the earth, the cold, clammy darkness swallowing me whole. My screams were swallowed by the abyss as the darkness closed in, and I felt myself being pulled deeper into the roots, into the very bones of the land. I could feel the town, the hollow, wrapping itself around me, pulling me in, forcing me to become a part of it. My body no longer belonged to me. My thoughts, my memories, they were fading into nothing. And just before the last of my consciousness slipped away, I realized the horrifying truth. The town wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a curse. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me.